Chaos! That's what ensued when this map shockingly collapsed. Pan Am, once the world's most important airline, gone. Instantly, 7,500 jobs vanished, as did pensions, futures. But one thing was abundantly clear: travel was about to change forever. But the map didn't quite disappear overnight. Pan Am had all sorts of money problems throughout the 80s and the early 90s, so it turned to selling its soul to other airlines. It started in 1985 when United Airlines inherited the entire Pan Am Pacific route network. One pilot described it perfectly. It was as if Pan Am had cut off its right arm. But overnight, United became a major player at airports like Tokyo-Narita, Los Angeles, and especially San Francisco, where they dominate today. But Pan Am still had money problems, even though they got $750 million from United. Just 5 years later, United called again, or maybe vice versa, where Pan Am sold United their entire operation at London Heathrow, which is arguably the world's most competitive airport when it comes to access, even today. But this still wouldn't be the craziest transaction. It was like 400 million something. That's because just a year later, the same year that Pan Am went bankrupt, Delta bought Pan Am's entire transatlantic route network from JFK for well over $1 billion. So pretty soon it became clear. Delta and United became powerhouses. They weren't just some tiny domestic airlines that no one wanted to mess with. They became two of the largest airlines in the world. And something else happened. The creation of a network airline. That's what these two airlines were. They served hundreds of destinations, including dozens globally. But while Delta and United were equipped with the international networks they always wanted, they wanted more. They weren't done growing. So they enhanced something called the hub-to-spoke model system. This is something that they largely had at airports like Chicago and Atlanta domestically before all of this Pan Am drama. But they wanted to make it even better, more sophisticated, more valuable. And Pan Am's transactions with the Atlantic and Pacific did exactly that. But what is the hub-to-spoke model system? It's probably something you've used before. For example, let's say you're trying to fly from Nashville to Nice in France. First, you have to go to New York, and then you have to flip the page, and then go from New York to Nice. The reason for this is, well, there's no non-stop from Nashville to Nice because there's not enough passenger demand. Even New York might not have enough demand to go from New York to Nice. So what airlines do is they'll add, in some cases, up to hundreds of destinations to a city, and then they connect that city to different points all over the country, all over the globe, like Nice. I really wish airlines would keep these magazines, especially for the map. It's too bad a lot of them don't have it anymore. Having trouble putting it back together. This is something that Pan Am always wanted. It wasn't some new trick that these airlines came up with. But Pan Am couldn't get access to it because of regulation. The airline industry was regulated up until 1978, where airlines like Pan Am couldn't just schedule routes wherever they wanted to. They had to get special permission from the government to do so. The government thought that, well, Pan Am already had a very robust international network with limited competition, although competition grew over time, where if they had this and a domestic network, then airlines couldn't really keep up with that. But it gets even crazier, because airlines still wanted more. Passengers wanted to fly everywhere, not just big cities like London or Tokyo. But there was a problem. Pan Am tried solving it first, with a smaller plane like the 727. They used the 727 on routes like London Heathrow to Athens, or Frankfurt to Cairo, as they had bases at both of these airports, London and Frankfurt. But Pan Am had a problem. They couldn't fly passengers from Frankfurt to Cairo. They had to connect over to North America into the US, or vice versa. So their operation was extremely expensive, and it was not sustainable. The only exception that they had was Berlin because, well, after World War II, Lufthansa wasn't allowed to operate into Berlin until the early 90s. Those pilots had an identity of their own, by the way, in Berlin. I mean, can you blame them? It's Berlin. A lot of things changed in the 90s, and this included the introduction of code-sharing to a mass scale. Code-sharing, where airlines could transfer passengers onto another airline seamlessly. And it solved Pan Am's old problem, where only passengers flying to the US could go on routes like, let's say, Frankfurt to London. Now, an airline like British Airways can fly both local passengers who are starting the trip in Frankfurt and ending in London, or they could fly passengers from Frankfurt to Chicago with a stopover in London. And this would be transferring on American Airlines. Speaking of American Airlines, they helped pioneer the concept of code sharing way back in the late 20s and early 30s with Delta Airlines, when both of these carriers didn't really have permission to fly on certain routes. So American would fly from Los Angeles to Dallas with stops in between, while Delta would do the same from Dallas over to Atlanta. Of course, now it's way more sophisticated, and code sharing is more about responding to customer demand. And it made the world interconnected, and we rely on this to this day. It gave rise to a global hub and spoke model system, where airports like London, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, Tokyo, and Seoul all became global hubs. But there was a shift happening. Power was going east to Europe and to Asia. But the shift really started happening well before that fateful day at the end of 1991 when Pan Am no longer was operating. It happened in the 70s, when Pan Am didn't really have any money to retrofit its planes with new interiors, and foreign airlines like Lufthansa, KLM, British Airways, Japan Airlines, Singapore were growing like crazy. Oh, and Virgin Atlantic too. I think Bond likes that one. Even though he used to like Pan Am, what a legend. So for the next couple of decades, when we're talking about premium travel and those types of experiences, they could typically be found on these types of airlines. Until it shifted to the Middle East, where it's been since 2010. Roughly. But not everyone cared about global networks or sophisticated hub and spoke model systems or fancy silverware or food. They just wanted to fly nonstop and cheap to places like Disney World, where I guess the bill really comes when you go to the park. In a couple of ways, Pan Am helped pioneer this as early as 1948 with a class called Rainbow or Tourism class. It was the first concept of economy. Pan Am's founder, Juan Trippe, didn't only envision a world where travel was only accessible to the ultra-wealthy, but to everyone. But eventually, low-cost airlines like Southwest and Ryanair were growing like wildfire, which ate into the market share of airlines like Delta and United, which drove prices down significantly. So airlines had to adapt, and a lot of services were cut. It was like a race to the bottom. People started treating travel like a commodity, like toothpaste, rather than paying a little bit extra for a better experience. Or so it seemed, at least. It made it way more accessible towards the middle class. Basically, everyone was going to fly, at least at one point in their life. Which leads us to today. Many travelers demand more. And ironically, they have a longing for the past, even if they weren't alive back then. How funny is that? So the industry is adapting to meet these new, or renewed, needs. Low-cost airlines like JetBlue and Frontier, depending on when you're watching this video, are in the process or already have added first class, or adding exotic destinations that you may have not thought about traveling to earlier, like Tahiti or Greenland or Sicily. And look, I get it. We might not see what we saw before with the second-story cocktail lounges on the Pan Am 747s, but one thing is for sure. Airlines like Pan Am are still influencing these types of decisions. They gave us the ultimate experience benchmark. Be sure to share this with all of your friends. Hop on board by subscribing right now and turning those notifications on. Really appreciate it. Fly further.